Hello and welcome to my video on power and conflict poetry. The focus of this video is to go through some of the key quotations and themes and just ideas about how you can explore the poems. This isn't specifically about linking them. You can make some of those links through the themes that we explore, but this is very much just a recap of the poems themselves. So some top tips of things that you need to remember to include. So we're going to start with Ozymandias. And this poem covers most prominently the power of humans, pride and power of nature as key themes. So one of the main quotes to start with to look at would be the quotation that many of you will know, many of you are aware of. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings." This shows arrogance. He thinks he's better than God. "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Shows the boastful nature of him, which is ironic because there is nothing left. And the sense that the statue that he is actually pointing to, if you like, with this particular plaque at the bottom of it, has disappeared. So his work, the work, has disappeared itself. "Sneer of a cold command." This is the use of alliteration, which sounds harsh. And that harsh sound shows he's controlling and is not a good leader. He rules through fear more than anything, and his controlling manner is clear through the way that he commands those below him. So you can link this to the Romantic Poets as it's written by Percy Shelley, and the idea is that Percy Shelley was trying to challenge through this poem. Although this was a poem written about Ramses II, an Egyptian pharaoh, and set obviously in an ancient time, it was written during the Romantic period as a poem challenging those in power at that time. The Romantic period was a time when poets were writing very cleverly, disguising their challenge of those in power. But for us today, looking at this poem, we can make those links. It's in the sonnet form, and it switches from a Petrarchan sonnet to a Shakespearean sonnet, and this represents that power changes hands from one to another. Power is not constant from one human. Once Ozymandias is dead, the power dies with him. And that is what this poem is about. Your human power will only last as long as you last. And it's kind of a mock to those in power through this. And the great drama of this poem shows this shattered visage, this statue that is broken, as a means of Percy Shelley showing that the power of nature long continues. I've spoken with my students about that. The erosion caused by the winds and sands in the desert have destroyed this statue. So nature has by definition destroyed this symbol of human power, demonstrating it is more powerful. And the structure of the poem represents that. Next, I want to move on to London. William Blake's poem about power of humans, the showing of powerless and hopelessness and fear. Again, another Romantic poet. So Blake writes, "In every cry of every man." These negative emotions are incredibly important to notice, and the repetition of every clearly emphasises that. "The mind-forged manacles." Demonstrates that people's minds are controlled. We talk about in lessons the church being very powerful during this time. The illiterate, the poor, those in poverty would be controlled by the sermons they are given in church, and very much the church was seen as a controlling force. People were taught to know their place through the teachings of the church and those in power above them. And obviously the church were hand in hand with those in power and were hand in hand with the monarchy of the time. Every blackening church appalls clearly shows that. The church should help the poor, but it is corrupt, and it's the corruption that is challenged. Blake did not like the established church. He was very much against the established church. He was very spiritual. He was religious in that sense, but he didn't like the controlling force of the establishment. The way that he felt the church should have been supporting the poor was actually a negative force. It was not supporting, it was corrupt and was not helping those who needed it most. It was the very opposite of what he thought the church should be. So, as I said, this links to the Romantic poets, and the Romantic movement were very much against those in power. There were lots of connections you can make to what was going on across the water in France. And the French Revolution and the revolutionary ideas were very much an influence to the Romantics. This poem has a cyclical structure. Verses 1 and 2 focus on people suffering, 3 focuses on the causes of suffering, and 4 is back to the people suffering. And that repetition of suffering is clear. It's a very powerful poem. And it's one of my group's favourites, I know, because of the simplicity of the language and the simplicity of the structure, but the powerful message that it is delivering. We move on to the Prelude, another poet of the Romantic movement, this time Wordsworth. And the main focus for themes in this would be fear, individual experience, memory, and identity. A huge peak, black and huge. This quotation is where the poem changes from positive to negative. There hung a darkness, call it solitude, as attack on man trying to control nature. This shows nature is too powerful to be controlled. Apologies for the typo. Well done for spotting it, those that did. So this poem starts off with a very strong, powerful young man stealthily stealing a boat, rowing, feeling confident, touch of arrogant, but then Mother Nature looms up, and that powerful nature that he had as a young man stealing this boat is lost, and he goes back to feeling fear. It was an act of stealth, a troubled pleasure, shows he's doing something secret and bad, but also enjoyable, and that contrast of how he feels is to do with that link that I have talked about with the groups that I teach. And one interpretation that we offer is this is about the awakening of an individual. When you are a young child, you may do things and break the rules, and you don't necessarily feel bad. That controlling measure of society comes a bit later. You go to your parents perhaps and admit something you've done wrong, and they say everything will be fine, and you feel fine. The guilt doesn't kick in. But at this point, the guilt starts to kick in with this act of stealth, and that guilt means that he then quickly changes tack and wants to go back to putting things right. And it's only when we reach that point where we can feel that control of society, that conscience that we feel at that point of awakening from sort of child to adult. So you notice the language choice changes. He starts off like a swan, and it changes to struck again, that loss of control. So like a swan, he feels that he can compare himself using this simile to a swan, graceful and brilliant on the water, but then he is unable to have that control. He talks about rowing in a straight line, and that confidence and arrogance comes through with, look how amazing I am at rowing. And suddenly when this guilt kicks in of this act of stealth and the fear that creeps in, that looms up, he then loses his graceful strokes of the oars and is unable to guide the boat gracefully anymore. So you can link this, as I said, to the Romantic poets. It's an epic poem form, one long stanza that makes the reader feel overwhelmed. So we relate to Wordsworth's view of nature. It is awe-inspiring. Nature is awe-inspiring and overwhelming. And he wants us to recognise the power and beauty of the natural world. Next, My Last Duchess. This particular poem is clearly linked to the power of humans, an element of the power of nature, pride, control. So I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together, shows he's powerful. The Duke is a powerful man. All smiles stopped together. He is able to stop a smile on a face, that kind of sinister undertone, that it's not just a smile that he has wiped out. The power and control is clear through this poem. And obviously it's based on a real story of an Italian duke where there was the intrigue of the death of a duchess. So that's my last Duchess painted on the wall. Shows he's very possessive and obsessive, and he has taken control of his Duchess. And the beauty of this particular section shows just how controlling he is, even when she is dead. The curtain across that painting demonstrates his control over her image. No one can look on her unless he deems it possible. He is very much a man in control and always wanting to be in control, possessive, obsessive. Talked about narcissistic before, all-controlling power. And actually, this was a poem that was written to challenge again the Victorian period at this point and the controlling force of marriage in general, although it was set in a previous time with a figure that everybody was aware of and a story that people knew. But the underlying message here is that it's also an attack on the constraints of marriage during the Victorian period. My gift of a 900 years old name, the arrogance and anger that she treated him like anyone else. He thinks that he was not treated appropriately by his Duchess, and so she must suffer. It's got strict iambic pentameter form throughout, clearly showing and reflecting, again, typo not picked up, reflecting the Duke's control. So it's incredibly important to look at and explore how form and structure here complement the message within the poem and what is being explored through this. He is an arrogant man in control, and the poem itself stays strictly in control to further emphasize his power. The Charge of the Light Brigade. A poem about the power of humans, the reality of conflict, effect of conflict, and the power of nature, fear and anger. The natural landscape within this poem is partly evident to the reality of what happened in this particular charge. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. So this powerful personification linked to a natural form, a mouth, jaws, shows the brigade are incredibly brave and courageous at bawling in front of this particular conflict, having to fight, having to follow the orders of a charge that was idiotic. It was foolish, but these brave men went on regardless into their death. They rode into their death. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, shows how they were overpowered on all sides and there was no hope, but they still went forward as they were ordered to. This poem very much by Tennyson, a poem to show his awe at their bravery. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die, shows the unquestioning loyalty of these men, of these soldiers, their bravery, clear bravery, and that has inspired this poem. Tennyson wrote this poem in honour of these brave men. It's a ballad form. Next, Exposure. Shows the power of humans, the reality of conflict, effect of conflict, power of nature, fear, anger, and all of these sections in brackets which link to themes can be challenged, can be explored, don't necessarily have to make every single one link. So, but nothing happens is a phrase that's repeated, suggesting there isn't a lot of fighting. They are sat waiting to die. 'Tis that we are dying. They are so affected by the cold that they think they're dead. And actually many would be dying too. They are dying from exposure. The exposure being the precursor to hypothermia, in the order of labelling the symptoms of dying from exposure to the cold, from getting cold. Exposure is a label we use before we hit hypothermia. You can suffer from exposure, and that is exactly what these soldiers are doing in the winter months in those trenches. Some were dying from the cold. Worried by silence. sentries whisper, curious, nervous. War is a lonely place, always aware, always alert, always prepared. So these soldiers were always anxious about what was coming, and the silence, the whispering, the curious, the nervousness was all brought on by this waiting game, and they waited and they waited. Trench warfare was not all action, and it's no wonder that many had issues with their nerves and the nervousness and mental illnesses that would be linked to that, because they were constantly waiting and actually almost waiting to die. When was the next attack going to happen? When was the next barrage about to hit the trenches? Wearied, we keep awake. War is hard on these men. Pointless, insomnia. And this links very much to Wilfred Owen's poem, Futility, pointlessness. Why are we here? What are we doing? Wilfred Owen's poetry is so powerful because he was a soldier fighting in the trenches in the First World War, fighting firsthand, experiencing firsthand, and being very honest about the reality. His poetry was very much a record to note the reality of war. It wasn't all glory. It wasn't all powerful glory. It was actually horrid. It was obviously dangerous, and it was an experience that men suffered both physically and mentally from afterwards. And this poem explores that waiting game exceptionally well. It's got a clear ABBAC rhyme scheme throughout, and uses para rhyme throughout. The consonant rhymes, but vowels don't. This creates a distressed or anxious tone to the poem that emphasises the fear and unease of the soldiers. Just imagine sitting and waiting, not knowing what was coming next, when you would be told to go over the top again, when you would be attacked again. That silence, that listening for tunnellers underneath, for shells about to explode around you, and this waiting, this listening, this silence of war, and this exposure to war. So next, storm on the island, and in red you can see that I've blocked out to make the word Stormont, and Stormont is the government building, and it links very, very, very closely obviously to then the government in Ireland, and then the links to the Troubles in Ireland. This is a poem very much about a storm, a literal storm, but the biggest message is the underlying metaphorical storm of the Troubles in Ireland. So this is about the power of nature, but it's also about the power of humans and the reality of conflict. We are prepared. This could be preparing for the storm, but also symbolising the Troubles, the IRA, the conflict, the bombings, but they are ready, they are prepared, and they are used to this conflict. Exploding comfortably is an oxymoron which suggests that. It links to the Troubles and very clearly suggests that these are two words that should not go together. You should not be comfortable with an explosion close by, but it emphasises the ongoing nature of this conflict, and that it has been such a paramount part of their lives that they, in Ireland, people of Ireland, have become used to it. And this used to it is demonstrated through this quite unusual oxymoron. And strafes invisibly, space in a salvo. There are lots of guns firing at once, and that's continuously, and this obviously references the ongoing consistency of this conflict. This has a dramatic monologue form, and it goes through the Troubles in Ireland, and is very much a poem based on that. Bayonet charge. There's an element of PTSD with it. This is about the power of humans, the effects of conflict, the reality of conflict and fear. Sweating like molten iron, suggesting panic. This soldier has suddenly got up and started running. He has perhaps been asleep, has been resting, and suddenly he's in combat instantly. And that panic is suggested through this simile. Bullets smacking the belly out of the air. Such a powerful image. Nature is being attacked. conflict. There are lots of references to the natural world being just as affected by this conflict as humanity. And this powerful image is incredibly clear through this powerful verb choice, smacking. His terror's touchy dynamite is showing the extreme panic of the soldier, and it links obviously to the war. The use of alliteration is almost bullet-like. Perhaps you could link to the sound of war itself. And it's important to notice that word terror, just to symbolise and show just how scared these soldiers were in this conflict. And that can link to the context of this. The First World War involved many that were under-trained, that were under-prepared, and were young men. The reality of the conflict is very much shown through this poem, and it explores both the effects on man and nature. 3 stanzas in mainly blank verse, showing and reflecting the uncontrolled nature of this particular piece. So next we go on to Remains, another poem which obviously contains PTSD. It talks about the powers of humans, the effects of conflict, guilt, individual experiences, memory. Probably armed, possibly not. Doubt about what he has done. And this particular phrase is repeated, which further emphasises this doubt. And this is very much what affects this soldier. If he was armed, would he feel the way that he does? The fact that he doesn't know if he was armed. This unarmed individual, this looter who has been attacked, he can't seem to reconcile himself to the idea that he may have shot someone who was not armed. His blood shadow stays on the street. This metaphor suggests he can't get the image out of his head. It's not actually stained on the street, but the image of this soldier dead on the street certainly stays with him, and every time he has to go past it, every time he has to walk down that street, every time he does a patrol near that street, that image plays on his mind, clearly emphasising his PTSD explained and developing. End of story, except not really. This links to the PTSD. It's the end of the story of that looter who's killed. It's the end of the story when it's the end of his particular time in combat, his tour of duty, but it's not the end of the story, because when he goes back home he is haunted by the reality of what he has done. His bloody life in my bloody hands is clearly about guilt for what he's done. It shows the PTSD, and there is that very clear link to Macbeth and the idea of blood on the hands representing guilt. He very much feels, this young soldier in this poem feels, he has blood on his hands, that he has acted unlawfully. He cannot reconcile himself to this particular murder on his hands. It's a monologue form, and it's very much one soldier's point of view and perspective. The remains of that soldier, that looter, stay with him, and the memories remain with him. There's an awful lot you can explore within the title of this poem itself, and how that links to the idea of guilt. Poppies, a poem exploring and linked to the theme of memory, loss and absence, the reality of conflict and the effects of conflict. The world overflowing like a treasure chest. Hassan, he's excited. He's got the world at his feet. There are 2 clear readings for this poem. Jane Weir herself suggests this is about a soldier who has died, and this is his funeral. And a mother is preparing her son, who was a soldier, for his funeral. But there's also a suggestion that perhaps this is about a mother preparing her son to go off and become a soldier, to go out into the big world on his own, either as a soldier or just as an individual, but she's having to let go. But those constant links to war, to the memories of conflict, to Remembrance Sunday, etc., make us clearly link this individual to a young soldier, as Jane Weir writes about this. He's excited. This treasure chest, this simile suggests that he is excited, and he has gone out into this world full of options and hope, yet actually this was a past overflowing like a treasure chest. His life is no longer overflowing like a treasure chest. It was, and now no longer is, if he has died. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, more meaningful for the narrator, as her son is going to war. or this is about a time when she has to remember and is going to remember her son. And every Armistice Sunday she will remember him as he has died in conflict. The sellotape bandage around my hand line is incredibly powerful. It's a motherly instinct to make him better, to make him look good. This is about her dressing him carefully and making sure that his uniform is perfect. There are no white cat hairs visible. They are all removed and taken. He looks perfect, ready for him to go and leave her. But the bandage, that particular word suggests that a hidden wound. It's a sellotape bandage you can see through, but you can't see through this wound of the mother. She doesn't have any visible wounds of conflict, but she has certainly got the emotional wounds of conflict because she has lost her son. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. The son is excited, but the mother is sad. And a split second and he is gone. And he is gone in a split second if he is shot down in conflict once. Very quickly, he is gone. In a dangerous situation, in a split second, his life can be gone. So that split second has those ever-ringing images of loss. We talk about things happening in a split second. And he was intoxicated. So he was excited. He was looking forward to what was going to be coming. He was off to fight. What that patriotism, perhaps intoxicated by the idea of fighting for king and country, but then gone. And this monologue form shows this mother's distress, sadness. The releasing the songbird from the cage, one of the most powerful lines for me. And the constant semantic field throughout this poem of both the felt making, her links to textile industry, that kind of domestic world is imaged through this poem, contrasting with the imagery, the semantic field of conflict and war, with the blockade and others. And it's important to look at both of those semantic fields as a measure of the conflict between the domestic life of the mother and the war experience of the son. War Photographer. A poem about the reality of conflict, memory, individual experience, guilt. He has a job to do. It's very practical. Even if others may judge him, he has a job to do. This war photographer, a friend of Caroline Duffy, who was the inspiration for this poem, really felt that he had a job to record the conflict around the world, and those images, those pictures were to tell the story of those that could not tell the stories themselves. All flesh is grass, death, negative experiences. This very, very powerful short quotation suggests the multitude of death around and the multiple images of dead and decaying bodies that this photographer must see. In his dark room, he is finally alone. Guilt, possibly PTSD. He has had this barrage of conflict. So the noise, the sounds, the experiences of conflict it must be overwhelming for anyone experiencing them, and he is experiencing them without directly being involved, yet he is directly in that point of conflict. In his dark room, he is finally able to process what he has experienced. A half-formed ghost, he remembers the cries. Away from conflict zone, he has time to think and reflect. Feels guilt, possibly. And that's clear through this. The half-formed ghost image is quite powerful. This could literally be the photograph developing before his eyes as he is in his dark room, sorting these images, creating his photographs from the negatives. But also, the half-formed ghost literally can mean the image of the person in that picture is now dead, is a ghost themselves. It's a dead body, but they have become a ghost. And he remembers the cries, he remembers those sounds, and the fact that he's remembered and haunted, the ghost word particularly pertinent here, haunted by what he has experienced. It has a cyclical structure. He arrives and he's arriving and leaving for his work. So regular structure and form which reflects the order he tries to maintain. He has to stay in control to do his job and get the stories of these conflicts told. A picture speaks 1,000 words. His photographs are important to try to get people to care. He feels they do not care. The people look at his photographs between the bath and pre-lunch beers, and they don't seem to properly recognise. They may have a tear, they may cry at that point, but then they put them away and forget about it. He wants people to not forget about these conflicts and to do something about them. He cannot shake. He cannot have blurred images. He has to stay in control. He has to be practical when he's on the job. But back home, the solution slop in trays can suggest that he is shaking and that actually the experience of what he has seen is difficult for him to process and deal with. But he feels it is incredibly important. Very powerful poem choice. Tissue. Literally about human skin. Paper is more precious than fighting over buildings. This poem is incredibly layered, and actually the tissue and tissue paper idea is pertinent with that. How of humans is explored identity, memory. Paper thinned by age or touching. Maps too shows how important paper is. And the idea of paper is constant through this poem and the thin layers of paper. And obviously it leads up to a particular form of tissue, meaning human tissue. And it explores in many ways, in many layers, the different kinds of paper that comes as part of our lives. Raise a structure never meant to last. So the paper thinned by age and touching, and the links to fondly looking over family memories, marked dates, etc. in a Quran is incredibly important in this poem. And maps are very important to show identity, but also to show barriers. Maps show boundaries. Maps show where countries are divided, and they mark out territory. So they are positive, but also negative. Unrhymed, irregular quatrains are used, and that perhaps represents the flimsy nature of tissues. And the life explored through this poem is full of images that show how fragile our life can be. And this reflects the fragile nature of relationships too, that inspired this poem. The poet's loss of connection to her father and the family dates she saw recorded that inspired a reconnection or reconciliation with him. So if you've ever heard the poet speak about this, she talks about her experience of looking through the Quran, finding that she was important, that her birth was written down, and that's, you know, she recognises that through this paper, through this record of her existence, that she is important to him and that they reconcile. And it's important to talk about and to look at the way that we use paper and how it can be used to define us, and how we can use it to help define ourselves. So identity is important through this poem too. The emigre. It's a female who leaves the native country, often for political reasons. So an individual experience this poem is about. Power of humans and memory, identity. There was once a country. This suggests it's a story like a child telling it. There once was a country, once upon a time, kind of feel to it, the kind of fairy tales feel. I have no passport, there is no way back at all. Permanent, she has to get used to a new life, a new identity, a new experience. She cannot go back to her country of origin. They mutter death. Negative, her home country is in ruins. That's very much an important part of this, that we do not know exactly where she has come from, but that's important because this particular refugee, this person who has moved, this emigrant, she has changed country, probably because of conflict. We surmise it's because of that, and she cannot go back because of persecution. We don't know the reason, but we don't know where it is either, but that's because this poem can reflect anybody at any point who has had to leave their motherland, their country of origin, and its own white plain. It's written in the first person perspective form and is very much about the past. Checking out my history. There's an informal Caribbean dialect to this very clearly, and finding out about his past and his identity is incredibly important. This poem is about individual experience, it's about memory, it's about identity, and it's very clearly got a tone of anger. Dem tell me, British imperialism and sense of lack of power and control over his history. This poem is about a fight, a demand, the anger at not having equal history. There is a sense that black history has been hidden, has been overridden by British white imperialism. Blind me from my own identity, keep me in the dark about my past, as it's not seen as important as British history. We know about the white history, we know about the names of the white people in history, but we don't know the counterparts who are from a different ethnicity. A healing star. There's lots of imagery through this poem of light and hope through these other less known famous people from history. Mary C. Cole, nurse who served in the Crimean War but was not celebrated for it. We all know the name of our Florence Nightingale character, our person in history from a white perspective, but Mary C. Cole was not a name as well known, but she should shine as brightly. She was a star too. And the fact that he calls her a healing star links to the nursing, but also how powerful that she was. She had to fight just as hard to get there as Florence Nightingale, and she saved and helped as much as Florence Nightingale. The irregular poem, short mixture of enjambment. It's got a story-like tone to it, but it's very, very fierce in its angry tone, and it is a poem about the lack of ethnicity in history. We have Mary C. Cole, we have Nanny de Maroon, and we have these other famous characters from history, from the stories, from nursery rhymes. We know their names more than we do Mary C. Cole, and that anger and frustration at that is clear through this poem. And Kamikaze, a Japanese pilot who would die for his country. This poem, on the surface, seems, when you look at that title, to just be about that, but it's very much about what that a kamikaze pilot might represent. It's about the power of nature, reality of conflict and guilt. So a one-way journey into history. The pilot knows he won't come back from his mission. That's the whole point. And it was a point of honour to go and fly your plane as a bomb into an American ship. But actually, was it what they wanted? Swiveled towards the sun. Nature made him think about life. And this pilot decided he wanted to live. And it's this image of light and the sun which changes his mind, which makes him hungry to survive and actually to not go through with the mission that he is supposed to have signed up for, which had been the better way to die. He is rejected by his family and is wondering whether turning back from his mission had been worth it. Nature and the power of nature ties him to wanting to survive, to live, which is probably the most powerful natural force that we have. And to be a kamikaze pilot must go against the natural order of being. But many did. But this particular pilot wanted to fight for his country. It was an honour to his family, and it was the dishonour to his family that made him rejected. And he's wondering whether he made the right decision or not. And this poem explores that. It has a narrative style, a simple structure, telling a simple, sad tale, but very powerful in the language choices to try to explain why he changed his mind. So that concludes all of the poems. It's a whistle-stop tour through some of them. Some we talked about in slightly more depth and detail. That there's no reason or rhyme to that. It's just exploring some key points from each of these poems. Now, what I've said you could challenge, you can argue, as long as you can justify your point of view with evidence. And that's the beauty of English and English literature. And what I want you to take from this video is what you can and what you will and what you like. Pick out some of the key points that you would like to. But one thing to remember when we are writing about poetry, when we are writing about this power and conflict collection, is to find poems that we can link together. Some of them maybe not quite so obviously, but to be able to have and create a clear line of argument to answer a question that will no doubt be thematically linked. So they will need to make thematic links between the poems. Every single one of these poems could be linked with every other poem. My advice is to write about the ones that you know the best, that you're the most passionate about, and the ones that you can quote from. Whatever poem you are given, you will know it, you will be prepared for, you will be able to write about it. And then you do actually have the power of control in this particular exam to then choose a poem for yourself that you would like to write about. So although it may seem quite scary, it's unseen, you don't know what you're going to get, you at least do have every poem at your disposal. You have been taught all 15 poems and you know them and you can do this. Please remember to write about language, structure and form. You must reference structure and form, and to a degree context where it's relevant, but you need to show a clear understanding of these poems in their entirety. Remember, in the exam you automatically have a title to use. Every poem is listed in a content section of the exam paper, so you have that, and if nothing else, then please analyse the title of the poem. Read the question carefully, look carefully at what you're asked to do. Take time to plan. My biggest wish here is that you plan your response and dare to plan more than one. Choose 1 or 2 poems that you could write about. Take that time, precious as it is, take some time to think about what you are going to write about. Plan perhaps 2 different poems that you could write about, and then choose the one that you know the best, the one that you can say the most about. And it might not be your first choice, your most obvious choice at first. Take a good 5 to 10 minutes and plan. And you will be fine. You know this, you've got this. All the very best for your exam on the Power and Conflict collection.